Dinner was supposed to be quiet that night. Just me and Claire, sharing a bottle of wine and catching up after another long day. I had been absorbed in work, and she'd been busy with her art classes. Routine, yes, but a good kind of routine. Or so I thought. We sat at the table, the soft glow of the chandelier casting warmth over her face. She seemed distant, though, poking at her food with her fork, glancing at me like she had rehearsed something in her head but wasn't sure how to say it out loud. I let it slide for a while, thinking she'd come around to whatever was bothering her. But then, out of nowhere, she set her fork down and said, "Ethan, I've been thinking about us. About me." It wasn't the words that alarmed me. It was the tone. There was a strange edge to it, a mix of hesitation and determination that instantly made me wary. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "Thinking about what, exactly?" I asked. She hesitated, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. I feel like I'm losing myself, like I'm stuck. I need something more, something different. There was a moment of silence between us, the kind that stretches uncomfortably and fills the air with invisible tension. I gave a short, dry laugh. Different? Like a new hobby? A vacation? What are we talking about here, Claire? Her eyes met mine, steady but almost apologetic. I need to feel alive again, Ethan, and I don't think I can do that within the boundaries of what we have. Alive. That word. It hit me like a punch to the gut, followed by a slow, creeping anger. Alive? I echoed. What does that even mean? Are you saying I don't make you feel alive? That's not what I'm saying. She was calm, too calm, and that only made me angrier. This isn't about you, Ethan. It's about me. I want to experience things, see where life takes me. I stared at her, trying to process what she was implying, and then it clicked. My voice dropped. If you so much as touch him, whoever he is, we're done. Her face didn't flinch. She just looked at me and said, "If I want to feel alive, I will." It was like all the air had been sucked out of the room. My heart pounded and my mind raced. "Alive? You'll feel alive packing your things at midnight," I said, my voice sharp, final. For the first time, she looked shaken, but she didn't back down. She didn't apologize. She just sat there, her silence screaming louder than any words could. And that's when I knew. Whatever came next, it would destroy us. I didn't sleep much that night. How could I? Claire's words played on a loop in my head like a bad song you can't escape. If I want to feel alive, I will. That wasn't something you could just unhear or brush off. It was a bombshell, and it left me sitting in the wreckage of what I thought was a solid, happy marriage. I tried to make sense of it, tried to convince myself that maybe I'd missed something along the way. Had I been blind? Complacent? I wasn't sure, but I needed to figure it out. The thing about marriage is, you don't see the cracks until they're pointed out to you. And once you do, you can't stop seeing them. Looking back, I realized Claire had been pulling away for months. It was in the little things, the way she used to laugh at my bad jokes but had stopped, the way she sat a little further away on the couch, the way her phone became her constant companion. But it wasn't always like this. We were good once. Great, even. I remember the early days, the long road trips with the windows down, singing along to terrible pop songs, the way we'd sneak out of work just to grab lunch together because an hour apart felt like too much. Claire had this spark, this light, and I was sure I'd never seen anyone so full of life. Somewhere along the way, though, life started crowding in. The routines, the schedules, the unspoken disappointments. I don't know when it happened exactly, but Claire started dimming. She threw herself into her art classes, and I buried myself in work. I thought we were just finding our balance, but maybe we were slowly drifting apart. And then there was the infertility. It's not something people talk about much, but it's there, this quiet, persistent ache. We tried for years, tests, treatments, even adoption discussions. Nothing worked. I thought we'd moved past it, but now I wondered if Claire hadn't. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I'd been missing the signs. The late nights she spent painting in the studio, the sudden interest in yoga retreats and self-discovery podcasts, the books with titles like Finding Yourself and the Art of Letting Go. Claire wasn't letting go of herself. She was letting go of us. And maybe I was too. I didn't notice it then, but I stopped trying. Stopped asking how her day was or surprising her with little gestures. Maybe I thought love was something you could set on autopilot once you'd been married long enough. But now, staring at the ceiling in the dark, all I could think was, is it too late? She was asleep beside me, or pretending to be. I watched her for a while, her face calm, peaceful, as if she hadn't just lit a match and thrown it at the foundation of our lives. I wanted to wake her up and demand answers. I wanted to ask if she still loved me, or if I'd become just another part of the routine she was trying to escape. Instead, I stayed silent. The cracks were there, no doubt about it. But the question that haunted me was whether they were too deep to fix, or if they'd been there all along, waiting to split us apart. I started noticing changes in Claire's schedule. She'd come home later than usual, citing an extra-long art class or catching up with a friend I'd never heard of before. It wasn't the first time she'd done something spontaneous. It was part of who she was. But this felt different, subtler, more deliberate. One night, she mentioned his name casually, as if it were nothing. "Noah," she said over dinner, swirling her wine glass like she didn't just drop a loaded grenade on the table. "Noah?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. "He's in one of my classes. He's a photographer. Really talented," she said, as if that explained why she had this slight glow about her that hadn't been there in months. I didn't push. Not that night. Instead, I tucked the name away, let it simmer. But it sat heavy in my gut, this sense that something wasn't right. The next week, she came home later again, this time carrying a small framed photo. It was of a stormy coastline, the kind of shot you'd see in a gallery. I couldn't help but notice the name scrawled in the corner. Noah Jacobs. "He gave it to me," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Said he thought I'd like it." I nodded, gripping the edge of the counter. Generous of him. "Don't make it weird, Ethan," she said, brushing past me. But it was weird. A man doesn't just hand over a professional print like that without expectations. The next few weeks, I felt like a detective in my own home, piecing together a puzzle no one invited me to solve. She was on her phone more, texting with a smile that didn't belong to me anymore. Her late nights became a pattern, and her excuses grew thinner. "Group critique ran long," she said once. Her cheeks flushed as she walked in the door. "At 10 p.m.?" I asked. She shrugged, avoiding my eyes. "It's art, Ethan. It's not a 9-to-5 kind of thing." It was small things like that. A change in her perfume. Something lighter, sweeter. The way she started caring about what she wore to her classes, even though she used to throw on old t-shirts and jeans without a second thought. I kept telling myself I was overreacting. Maybe this was her way of reclaiming herself like she'd been saying. Maybe Noah was just a friend. But then I caught a glimpse of her phone one night while she was in the shower. A message lit up on the screen. "Noah, can't wait to see you tomorrow." My stomach dropped. When she came out of the bathroom, I was sitting there, phone in hand. I didn't open it. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of accusing me of snooping. "Who's Noah?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp enough to cut. Her face hardened, but she didn't flinch. "He's a friend, Ethan. Don't turn this into something it's not." "Friends don't text each other like that," I said, holding up the phone. She snatched it from me, her eyes flashing. "I'm not doing this with you." And just like that, she walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the storm brewing inside me. Was I overthinking it? Blowing it out of proportion? Or was this the beginning of something that would tear us apart? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear. Noah wasn't just some harmless new friend. Not to her. And definitely not to me. Things came to a head faster than I expected. After weeks of suspicious glances, half-truths, and late nights, I hit my breaking point. It wasn't a specific moment, really. More like a slow boil that finally spilled over. Claire wasn't just distant anymore. She was defensive, almost combative. It was like she had this secret world she didn't want me to see, and I wasn't about to keep pretending I didn't notice. One evening, she walked in later than usual, her cheeks flushed from the cold, or maybe from whatever she'd been doing. She tossed her bag on the counter and gave me a quick, distracted kiss on the cheek. "How was class?" I asked, my tone sharp enough to make her pause. "It was fine," she said, shrugging off her coat. "Fine?" I repeated, standing in the doorway. "Funny, because Victor said you weren't at class tonight." Her head snapped up. For a moment, she looked genuinely confused, then furious. "Victor? Who the hell is Victor?" "My private investigator," I said, crossing my arms. "I hired him a few weeks ago. He's very thorough." Her face drained of color, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. "You had me followed?" "Yes, Claire. Because when my wife starts coming home late and acting like a stranger, I'd rather know the truth than live in denial." For a second, I thought she might deny it. Tell me Victor was wrong. Instead, she laughed. A sharp, bitter sound that cut through the tension. "Wow, this is where we are now? Spying on each other?" "This isn't about spying," I snapped. "It's about trust. And right now, you're giving me every reason not to trust you." She threw her bag onto the couch and turned to face me, arms crossed. "What exactly do you think you know, Ethan? That I've made a friend? That I've dared to spend time with someone who doesn't make me feel like I'm suffocating?" Her words hit like a punch to the gut, but I didn't let it show. "A friend? Is that what you call it? Meeting him after class, texting him late at night, lying to me about where you've been? That's not friendship, Claire, that's betrayal." "I haven't done anything wrong," she yelled, her voice cracking. "Not yet," I shot back, "but you're dancing dangerously close to the line." She stared at me, her eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. Guilt? Anger? Fear? Maybe all of it. "You don't understand," she said, her voice quieter now. "Then help me understand," I said, stepping closer. "Because all I see is you tearing us apart for... what? A spark? Some fleeting thrill?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "It's not about him, Ethan. It's about me. I need to feel alive again, and I can't do that here. Not like this." I felt my chest tighten. "So I'm not enough for you anymore?" Her silence said everything. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "Listen to me carefully, Claire. If you so much as touch him, we're done. Do you understand me?" She met my eyes, her jaw set. "If I want to feel alive, I will." The room felt like it might implode. I turned and walked away, slamming the door behind me. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't sure if Claire and I could survive this. And worse, I wasn't sure if she even wanted us to. She left on a Friday. I remember it vividly because it was the first night I didn't try to stop her. It wasn't an argument that pushed her out the door this time. No shouting, no ultimatums. It was just her, packing a weekend bag while I sat in the living room pretending to watch TV. "Going somewhere?" I asked, keeping my voice as casual as I could. "Art retreat," she said without looking at me, zipping her bag shut. "Art retreat," I echoed, nodding slowly. "And Noah's going to be there?" Her hands froze for a split second, then resumed their deliberate movements. "It's not about him, Ethan. I told you that." "You've told me a lot of things, Claire," I said, finally turning to look at her. "Forgive me if I'm having a hard time believing any of them." She sighed, slinging the bag over her shoulder. "This is exactly why I need space. You've already decided what you think is happening. Nothing I say will change your mind. I stood up, my frustration bubbling just under the surface. Maybe because what I think is happening is happening. Or do you really expect me to believe this has nothing to do with the guy who's been texting you? Can't wait to see you at midnight? She stared at me, her expression unreadable. For a moment, I thought she might argue, but instead, she just shook her head. I'll be back Sunday night, she said quietly before walking out the door. And just like that, she was gone. The silence in the house was deafening. I sat back down, staring at the blank TV screen, my mind racing. Part of me wanted to follow her, to show up at this so-called retreat and catch her in the act. But another part of me, the part that was exhausted from weeks of fighting, knew it wouldn't change anything. Instead, I spent the weekend preparing. Not for her return, but for what came next. I called a lawyer. I started moving money into separate accounts, documenting everything. Texts, receipts, even the GPS logs from Victor, my private investigator. I wasn't going to be blindsided. If Claire was determined to throw away our marriage, I'd be ready to protect myself when the pieces fell apart. But the truth? None of it made me feel better. Every step I took felt like admitting defeat, like accepting that the life we'd built together was already over. When Sunday night rolled around, I was sitting in the kitchen, nursing a glass of whiskey, when I heard her key in the lock. She walked in, looking tired but lighter somehow. "Hey," she said, setting her bag down by the door. "Hey," I replied, my voice flat. She hesitated like she wasn't sure what to say. The retreat was good, productive. "Good for you," I said, not bothering to mask the sarcasm. She didn't respond, just picked up her bag and headed upstairs. I sat there, staring into my glass, wondering what exactly she'd been doing all weekend. And worse, wondering if I even wanted to know. That night, lying in bed next to her, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit before. Whatever Claire was looking for, she wasn't going to find it here. Not with me. And maybe, just maybe, I wasn't enough anymore. By the time Claire suggested couples therapy, I had already decided my course of action. I didn't argue with her. Why would I? If she thought sitting in a room with a therapist would fix the mess she'd created, let her believe it. I'd play along. "Therapy could be good for us," she said one night over dinner, the first civil conversation we'd had in weeks. "Sure," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "If you think it'll help, I'm willing to try." She looked surprised, maybe even a little relieved. It was the reaction I wanted, the one that would keep her off guard. I wasn't about to let her know that therapy wasn't about fixing anything for me. It was about learning exactly where she stood and how far she was willing to go to protect her lies. Our first session with Dr. Morgan was revealing, to say the least. Claire walked in with this air of confidence, ready to spill her version of events. How she felt suffocated, how she'd lost herself, how this wasn't about me, but about her own self-discovery. I sat there, listening, nodding in all the right places, while internally, I was cataloging every word, every subtle shift in her tone. Dr. Morgan, to her credit, didn't let Claire skate by with vague explanations. "Claire, when you say you've lost yourself, what do you mean? Can you give us a specific example?" Claire hesitated, her gaze darting to me. "I don't know. I guess I just feel like I'm not the same person I was when we got married. Like I've stopped growing and it's frustrating." "And Noah helps you grow?" I asked, my voice calm but pointed. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing. "This isn't about Noah, Ethan. How many times do I have to say that?" "It's hard to believe that when his name keeps coming up," I shot back, leaning forward. Dr. Morgan raised a hand to pause us. "Let's focus on what Claire is feeling, Ethan. We'll get to your concerns in a moment." I bit my tongue, forcing myself to relax back into the chair. This was a game of patience, and I needed to play it well. Over the next few sessions, Claire continued her narrative of dissatisfaction and self-discovery, while I carefully fed just enough of my own frustrations into the conversation to seem engaged. I wasn't lying. I was angry, hurt, and betrayed, but I wasn't going to show my full hand. Not yet. What Claire didn't realize was that while she was baring her soul to Dr. Morgan, I was building my case outside that office. The investigator's reports, the text messages, the timeline of her art retreats and late nights. It was all coming together. The therapy sessions weren't a fix. They were a mirror, reflecting just how far we'd fallen and how much Claire had changed. On the surface, I was the husband trying to save his marriage, willing to do whatever it took to make things work. But in reality, I was laying the groundwork for the moment when I'd have everything I needed to confront her. The trap wasn't set yet, but the pieces were falling into place. All I had to do now was wait for Claire to step into it. And knowing her, it wouldn't be long. The night it all came crashing down started like any other. Claire said she was going to meet some of her classmates for drinks after her art class. She smiled when she told me, but it wasn't the kind of smile I'd fallen in love with. It was the kind that didn't quite reach her eyes. The kind that told me she had already convinced herself she wasn't doing anything wrong. "Don't wait up," she said, slipping into her coat. "I won't," I replied, barely looking up from my laptop. But I did wait. Of course I did. And when I was sure she wasn't just meeting her classmates, I called Victor, my investigator, to confirm what I already knew. "She's at the Artisan Bar," he said, "with Noah." I got in my car and drove there, my mind racing the entire way. I wasn't even angry anymore, not in the shouting, throwing things kind of way. No, this was something colder, sharper. It was the kind of anger that makes you see everything clearly, like a storm breaking to reveal the wreckage. When I walked into the bar, it didn't take long to spot them. Claire was sitting in a corner booth, laughing at something Noah said. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, and I could see the way she leaned in, the way her whole body seemed to radiate something I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't heartbreak I felt in that moment. It was betrayal. And the sick, twisted thing about betrayal is that it doesn't just hurt. It makes you question everything, every laugh, every kiss, every promise. I didn't make a scene. That's not my style. Instead, I walked right up to their table and waited for Claire to notice me. When she did, her eyes widened and her hand shot back to her lap as if she'd been burned. "Ethan," she stammered, her voice shaky. "Noah," I said, ignoring her and turning to him instead. "Nice to finally meet you." He looked uncomfortable, glancing between Claire and me like he was trying to figure out the quickest way to disappear. "I think it's time for you to leave," I said to him, my tone calm but firm. "Ethan, don't," Claire started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "This isn't about him," I said, my eyes locking onto hers. "This is about us, and it ends now." She followed me out of the bar, practically running to keep up. "You didn't have to do that," she hissed, her face flushed with embarrassment, or maybe anger. "Oh, I absolutely did," I said, unlocking the car. The drive home was silent. I didn't speak, and neither did she. It wasn't until we were back in the house that I finally turned to her. "You feel alive now, Claire?" I asked, my voice low but heavy with the weight of everything I'd been holding in. Because here's what's going to happen. If you want him, if you want this so-called freedom, then you can start packing your things right now. Midnight's the deadline. Her mouth opened, then closed again. For once, she didn't have a quick retort. "I didn't," she started, but I cut her off. "Don't lie to me. Don't insult me like that. You've been lying to yourself long enough. It stops here." She stood there stunned as I walked away. Upstairs, I closed the bedroom door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, waiting to see what choice she would make. Would she fight for us? Or had she already decided we weren't worth saving? At that moment, I wasn't sure I cared about the answer anymore. The house was painfully quiet after that night. Claire stayed for now, but it wasn't the kind of staying that felt like a choice. It felt like inertia, like she was still here because leaving meant facing the reality she'd tried so hard to avoid. I didn't push her out, but I didn't make it easy for her either. The lines were drawn. I'd said my piece at the bar, and now it was up to her to decide if she wanted to cross them. In the days that followed, we became strangers living under the same roof. We barely spoke except for the occasional exchange of necessary words. "There's coffee?" Or, "Did you get the mail?" And even those were clipped, devoid of any warmth. I'd never known silence could be so loud. I spent my nights in the guest room, lying awake and staring at the ceiling. I could hear her sometimes, moving around in our bedroom, opening drawers, pacing. What was she thinking? Regret? Relief? Or was she already planning her next move? One evening, I came home to find her suitcase by the door. My heart skipped, but I forced myself to stay composed. "Going somewhere?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. She turned, her expression unreadable. "Julia's," she said simply. "I need some space to think." I nodded, my face a mask. "Take all the time you need." She hesitated, like she was waiting for me to stop her, to say something, anything that would pull her back. But I didn't. I couldn't. She walked out the door, and just like that, the house wasn't quiet anymore. It was empty. The days without her were strange. I should have felt a sense of freedom, maybe even relief, but all I felt was the ache of everything unsaid. I'd spent weeks preparing for this moment, yet nothing had prepared me for the loneliness that followed. I threw myself into work, trying to fill the void with meetings and deadlines. But every time I came home, the emptiness hit me like a tidal wave. The coffee mug she always left on the counter was gone. Her shoes weren't by the door. The silence that once felt oppressive was now unbearable. Julia called me once, a few days after Claire left. "She's doing okay," she said cautiously. "But Ethan, she's a mess. She knows she screwed up." "Good," I replied coldly. "She should feel like a mess." Julia sighed. "And what about you? How are you feeling?" "I'm fine," I said, even though it was a lie. But I wasn't fine. I was angry. Not just at Claire, but at myself. How had we gotten here? How had I let it get this far? Meanwhile, Claire wasn't the only one feeling the fallout. Noah, as it turned out, wasn't as invested in her as she'd thought. I heard through Victor that their communication had stopped entirely. Whether it was guilt, fear, or the realization that she was too much baggage, I didn't care. All I knew was that she was alone. And so was I. The thing about separation is, it gives you a lot of time to think. Too much time. I replayed every fight, every cold glance, every word I should have said differently. But none of it mattered anymore. Claire had walked out, and now it was up to her to decide if she wanted to come back. The question was, even if she did, would I let her? Or was the damage already too great to repair? The first time I heard from Claire after she left, it was a single line in a text message. "Can we talk?" I stared at my phone for a long time before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore her, to make her feel the same emptiness I had been drowning in since she walked out. But the other part, the part that still remembered the woman I fell in love with, needed to hear what she had to say. We met at a cafe, neutral ground. She arrived first, sitting at a corner table with her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. She looked tired, thinner, like the weight of her choices was finally catching up to her. "Thanks for coming," she said quietly when I sat down. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak yet. She took a deep breath, her eyes darting around the room as if she were searching for the right words. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," she began. "About us. About me. And I owe you an apology, Ethan." It wasn't what I expected. I thought she'd come with excuses or justifications, but her voice was raw, almost broken. "I was selfish," she continued. "I let my own insecurities and unhappiness blind me to what we had. and I hurt you in ways I can't even begin to make up for. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Go on, I said, my tone harsher than I intended. She winced but pressed on. I thought I needed something outside of our marriage to feel whole again. But the truth is, I was running from myself. From the parts of me I didn't want to face. And in doing that, I almost destroyed the best thing in my life. Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. For the first time in weeks, I saw a glimmer of the Claire I used to know, the one who didn't hide behind excuses or distractions. I've started therapy, she said, her voice trembling. Real therapy, not just for us, but for me. I need to understand why I did what I did, why I pushed you away, and why I couldn't see that you were enough, more than enough. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to forgive her on the spot, to take her hand and tell her we could start over. But another part of me, the part that had lived through the lies and the betrayal, wasn't ready to let go of the anger. I don't know if I can trust you again, I said finally, my voice low but steady. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I understand, she said, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove to you that I'm serious about fixing this, about fixing us. We sat in silence for a moment, the sounds of the cafe fading into the background. I studied her face, searching for signs of deceit or manipulation, but all I saw was vulnerability. I need time, I said at last. She nodded, wiping at her eyes. Take all the time you need. Just don't shut me out completely. Please. As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange mix of emotions, relief, hope, and an ache that still lingered deep in my chest. Claire was trying to fix what she'd broken, and for the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. But trust isn't something you rebuild overnight. It's a slow, painful process. And as much as I wanted to believe her words, I knew actions would speak louder. Time would tell if Claire's redemption was real, or just another illusion. When Claire came back to the house for the first time, it wasn't planned. I wasn't expecting her, and I certainly wasn't sure I was ready to see her. She texted me earlier that day asking if we could meet, but she didn't say she'd come to the house. I heard her knock and for a moment thought about not answering. But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pulled me to the door. There she was, standing on the porch with a small notebook in one hand and an almost shy expression on her face. She looked different, not just in appearance, but in presence. There was a softness to her, a humility I hadn't seen in a long time. I didn't mean to show up unannounced, she said, her voice quiet. But I needed to see you. I stepped aside, letting her in. It felt strange, having her in the house again. She looked around like she was seeing it for the first time, her eyes lingering on little things, the picture frames on the mantel, the worn edges of the couch, the half-empty coffee cup I'd left on the table. Have a seat, I said, gesturing to the living room. She sat on the edge of the couch, clutching the notebook like it was a lifeline. I've been writing, she said, holding it up. Things I never said. Things I should have told you instead of running away. I stayed standing, arms crossed, waiting. She opened the notebook, her hands trembling slightly. I didn't know how to face my own feelings, Ethan. I didn't know how to tell you that I was scared, of us, of what we'd become. And instead of working through it with you, I took the coward's way out. I hurt you, and I hurt myself in the process. Her voice cracked, and she paused, taking a shaky breath. I know words aren't enough, but I'm trying to be better, to understand myself so I can be the person you deserve. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself to speak yet. She looked up at me, her eyes glassy but determined. I don't expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to try. I want to rebuild what we had, if you'll let me, if we even can. The room felt heavy with the weight of her words. For weeks, I'd imagined this moment, wondering if I'd feel anger, relief, or indifference. What I felt instead was exhaustion, an emotional weariness that had seeped into every part of me. "I don't know, Claire," I said finally, sitting down across from her. "I don't know if we can go back to what we were. Too much has happened." She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks.